A black single mom boards a flight with her young son, hoping for nothing more than a peaceful journey. But as she struggles to settle in, a flight attendant singles her out, dismissing her requests for help and humiliating her in front of the entire cabin. When her son accidentally spills his juice, the flight attendant's sharp reprimand is loud enough for everyone to hear. What the attendant doesn't realize is that the quiet, composed woman she just targeted has a powerful ally waiting at the gate: her brother, a high-profile civil rights lawyer. By the time the plane lands, everything has changed, and the flight attendant is about to learn a lesson she won't soon forget. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from today. If this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Rachel Carter had learned long ago that airports, much like the streets she walked daily, carried their own subtle hierarchy, one that had little to do with ticket class and everything to do with who you were when you stood in line. She felt it now, in the shifting of gazes around her, the way conversations softened or cut short when she stepped closer to the gate with her son Jordan clutching her hand. It wasn't blatant. These things rarely were. They never shouted, they whispered, leaked into the seams of ordinary life until you questioned whether you imagined it. "Mama, look." Jordan tugged at her arm, pointing at the plane just beyond the window. His voice, loud and bright with wonder, cut through the murmurs around them. Rachel smiled down at him, but the warmth in her chest was tempered by the sharpness of a glance from across the terminal. A woman, older, wearing pearls and a cashmere scarf, arched a single brow over her magazine. Rachel met her gaze briefly before turning away. "It's so big," Jordan whispered, pressing his small hands against the glass. "It is, baby," Rachel replied, crouching beside him. "This is your first time flying?" "Huh? It's going to be exciting." Her words felt thinner than she intended. She wanted this trip to mean something more, to be a memory he'd carry for years. One unburdened by the small humiliations that often dotted her day. When they stood again, Rachel's eyes scanned the gate for their flight. The line had begun to form, and Rachel adjusted the strap on her worn duffel bag, nudging Jordan gently toward the queue. The attendant at the front was impossible to miss. Tall, lean, and sharp-featured, she wore her uniform like armor, her posture rigid as she guided each passenger forward with a mechanical smile. Rachel clocked the slight shift in the woman's face the moment she saw them approaching. It was quick, barely the hesitation of a heartbeat, but Rachel caught it. The subtle hardening of the jaw, the half-second delay before that polite, professional mask slid into place. "Tickets, please," the woman said. Rachel handed them over, feeling the attendant's eyes linger longer than necessary on Jordan, who hugged his dinosaur close. The woman's name tag read Linda. Rachel forced a smile as Linda handed the tickets back without meeting her gaze. "Thank you," Rachel said quietly. Linda's nod was perfunctory, dismissive. "Boarding to your left." "No, enjoy your flight." No eye contact. Rachel swallowed the familiar ache of it, the kind that left no visible bruise but clung to the edges of her pride like a shadow. She guided Jordan toward the jet bridge, reminding herself that none of this was new. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Inside the plane, Rachel focused on finding their seats. Jordan skipped ahead, his excitement unshaken by the heaviness his mother carried. She spotted their row and nudged him in. "Sit by the window," she whispered, trying to make the moment feel special. As she lifted her bag toward the overhead compartment, her grip slipped. "Let me," a man nearby, older with kind eyes, began to rise from his seat to help. But before he could, Linda appeared again, this time from nowhere. "Ma'am, please handle your own luggage," she said curtly, her voice louder than necessary. Rachel froze, the words hanging in the air for just a beat too long. Passengers nearby glanced up from their books and screens. Rachel's skin prickled under the weight of their attention. "I've got it," Rachel murmured, forcing the bag into place with a quick shove. Jordan, oblivious, peered out the window at the tarmac below. Rachel sank into her seat, heart thrumming. She kept her eyes forward, but Linda's presence still lingered at the edge of her vision. The attendant didn't move until Rachel's bag was fully secured. And then she was gone, her polished shoes clicking softly down the aisle. Rachel exhaled slowly, her pulse settling. This wasn't new, she reminded herself, but that didn't make it easier. Rachel Carter had long understood that dignity, in certain spaces, was something you carried quietly. It wasn't spoken of, it sat with you, pressed into the same worn corners where patience and restraint took their place. It was the kind of dignity you passed down like a family heirloom, the kind that taught you how to stand taller. Even when the world tried to make you feel small, she felt the weight of it now. Seated in the narrow aisle beside her son, Jordan, his small body hummed with excitement, nose pressed to the window. The hum of the cabin blended with the faint murmurs of passengers settling into their seats. Rachel traced the edge of her tray table with her thumb, grounding herself in the simplicity of the moment. This was supposed to be their escape, Jordan's first flight, his first real adventure beyond the borders of their neighborhood. And yet, even here, high above the ground, Rachel could feel the undercurrent of something unspoken. Linda's voice still echoed in her ears. Handle your own luggage. Rachel had replayed the moment countless times, the sharp edge of the flight attendant's tone cutting through the quiet. Across the aisle, the older man who had offered to help sat quietly reading. He hadn't said much after Linda intervened, but the soft glance he gave Rachel was heavy with the understanding of someone who had seen these moments before. She offered him a faint smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Mama? Jordan's voice pulled her back. Can I have my crayons? Rachel rummaged through her bag, careful to avoid bumping the passenger beside her. She handed Jordan the small pack and watched as he eagerly opened his coloring book. As he bent over the page, Rachel allowed herself a small breath of relief. Let the rest of the flight pass without incident. Let this be the worst of it. But peace, Rachel had learned, was rarely something you were given for free. The cabin had settled, and the flight attendants began moving down the aisle with the beverage cart. Rachel glanced at the overhead bin, recalling how Linda's eyes had lingered there, as if she expected Rachel's bag to spill out at any moment, causing chaos. She tucked that memory away, watching as Linda approached. What can I get for you? Linda's tone, while polite, lacked the warmth she had offered the passengers seated ahead. Water, please, and orange juice for him. Rachel nodded toward Jordan, who was too focused on his dinosaurs to notice the transaction. Linda poured the drinks, placing them down with a little more force than necessary. The orange juice nearly tipped, but Rachel caught it before it spilled. Thank you, Rachel said, her voice calm but measured. Linda did not respond. Rachel pressed her lips together and turned back to Jordan. The boy eagerly reached for his cup, his hands small and unsteady. The accident happened in an instant. Jordan's arm knocked against the tray, and the orange juice tumbled forward, spilling across his lap. His eyes widened in panic. I'm sorry, Mama. Rachel's heart sank. It's okay, baby, she whispered, already digging through her bag for napkins. Before she could react further, Linda was there. Her shadow fell over Rachel like a cold wind. You need to be more careful. Linda's voice cut sharply through the air, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Rachel's hands stilled, her grip tightening around the damp napkins. I'll handle it, she said softly, but Linda wasn't finished. This can't happen during the flight. We can't have spills creating hazards for other passengers. Rachel met her gaze this time. Holding it steady, she could feel the stares around her, the quiet judgment rippling through the cabin. I said I've got it, Rachel repeated, slower this time. Linda's eyes narrowed, as if to challenge her, but something in Rachel's expression made her step back. Rachel wiped Jordan's lap, her hands trembling slightly. He looked up at her, eyes brimming with worry. It's okay, sweetheart, Rachel whispered, smoothing his hair. From across the aisle, the older man leaned forward again. Without a word, he handed Rachel a handful of extra napkins. Thank you, Rachel said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled gently. Kids spill things. It happens. Rachel nodded, swallowing the lump rising in her throat. But the tightness lingered. It wasn't the spill that bothered her. It wasn't even Linda's tone, harsh as it was. It was the feeling, the knowing that if Rachel had looked different, if her skin had been lighter, Linda's response might have been softer. She wondered if the other passengers felt it too. Or if, like so many times before, they chose not to see. Rachel Carter knew there were different kinds of silence. Some were soft, like the hush that fell over a room just before dawn. But the silence she felt now, as Linda retreated down the aisle, was the heavy kind, the kind that made you feel like every pair of eyes was pressed against your skin. She dabbed at Jordan's jeans with the last of the napkins, feeling the dampness sink into her fingers. He sat still, head low, as if shrinking might somehow erase the spill. The attention, the sound of Linda's sharp reprimand. Rachel's movements slowed, her breath steady but shallow. She had learned, long ago, how to contain this feeling, this burn of humiliation that didn't show itself in tears but settled somewhere deeper, where it couldn't be touched. The man across the aisle offered another napkin with a faint nod. But Rachel didn't look up right away. She already knew his kindness was genuine. But it wouldn't change the fact that no one else had moved. Not a word, not a glance in her defense. Jordan tugged lightly at her sleeve. "I didn't mean to, Mama," he whispered, barely audible over the hum of the engine. Rachel forced a smile, brushing her hand over his curls. "I know, baby. It's okay. Don't worry about it." But Jordan wasn't the one she was speaking to. The plane soared steadily over clouds. But Rachel's mind lingered somewhere below, grounded in the space between the cabin's aisles and the weight that had settled in her chest. Jordan had drifted off, his head resting against her arm, the coloring book open but forgotten in his lap. Rachel kept still, not wanting to disturb him. She found a strange comfort in his sleeping form, his breathing soft and even, unburdened by the undercurrents that rippled through her. But as she sat there, Rachel became aware of Linda's return. The flight attendant moved quietly down the aisle, speaking to passengers with a gentle smile, a light touch on the shoulder. She laughed at the jokes told by the couple in row 8. Bent to offer an extra blanket to the elderly woman near the exit row. Rachel watched it all unfold, and with every step closer to her row, something inside her tensed. When Linda finally stopped beside her, the warmth Rachel had seen moments earlier was gone. Linda glanced at Jordan, then at the empty cup still resting on the tray. She didn't speak at first, but Rachel could feel the weight of her presence. "Is everything settled here?" Linda asked, her voice measured, clipped. Rachel met her eyes, her tone even. "Yes, we're fine." Linda nodded but lingered a beat longer. "Good, we like to keep things orderly." Rachel's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Linda left without waiting for a response. As the flight continued, Rachel's gaze drifted to the small interactions that filled the cabin, the ease with which others navigated the space, free from the quiet scrutiny she carried with her. A man asked for an extra drink without hesitation. A woman across the aisle laughed loudly, unbothered by the attention she drew. Rachel envied that freedom, because the truth was, no matter how polite she was, how careful, there was always the lingering thought that someone, somewhere, might decide she didn't belong. And there was nothing louder than the silence that followed. When the plane began its descent, Jordan stirred beside her. He stretched, rubbing his eyes, and looked up at Rachel with a sleepy smile. "Are we there yet?" he asked. "Almost," Rachel said, smoothing his hair. "Just a little longer." Passengers shifted in their seats, reaching for bags and jackets. Rachel did the same, quietly preparing to gather her things. But as she stood to retrieve her carry-on, Linda appeared once more, standing directly in her path. "Please stay seated until the rows ahead have cleared," Linda said, her gaze firm. Rachel's hand froze on the handle of her bag. "I know," she replied calmly. Linda didn't move. Rachel felt the impatience of the passengers behind her. The subtle glances exchanged across the row. The elderly man across the aisle stood once more, his presence like a small anchor in the sea of discomfort. "She's not holding anyone up," he said, his voice kind but firm. Linda's mouth tightened. She glanced briefly at him before stepping aside. Rachel lifted her bag carefully, settling it over her shoulder. She didn't look at Linda as she passed, but Jordan glanced back over his shoulder, his small hand tightening around Rachel's. And as they stepped into the terminal, Rachel felt the silence follow them, heavy but no longer suffocating. Because this time, she wasn't the only one who had noticed. Rachel Carter had always believed that time should smooth the edges of a day's humiliation. That by the time the wheels touched the tarmac, the sting of what had passed might ease into something more manageable, something she could file away. Yet another quiet indignity, folded neatly into memory. But as the plane taxied toward the gate, Rachel felt none of that relief. She sat still, Jordan's hand resting on her knee, his fingers absent-mindedly drumming against her leg. The cabin was filled with the usual hum of arrival, the clicks of seatbelts, The rustle of bags being gathered overhead, but beneath it all, Rachel sensed the quiet tension that lingered like an unwelcome passenger. Linda's eyes found her again, just briefly, from the front of the plane, a glance Rachel might have missed if not for the weight it carried. It wasn't angry. No, Linda's gaze held something colder, a disinterest so practiced it felt intentional. The look of someone who had long since stopped asking themselves why they behaved the way they did. Rachel turned away first, shifting her attention back to Jordan, who was kicking his legs gently against the seat in front of him. He was humming softly, as if the morning's events had already dissolved into the haze of his short memory. If only it were that simple. The aisle began to clear slowly. Row by row, Rachel held Jordan's hand, waiting patiently for their turn. The man across the aisle, who had offered his quiet solidarity, caught her eye again. He nodded toward the overhead bin. "Let me help you with that," he said. Rachel hesitated. She didn't want to accept. Not because she was too proud, but because she feared what accepting would confirm that the simplest kindness felt rare enough to be precious. "Thank you," Rachel said softly. The man lifted her bag with ease, setting it down gently by her feet. His hands, weathered and lined with age, worked without the expectation of gratitude. "You remind me of my daughter," he said, almost as an afterthought. "She's raising 2 little ones on her own." Rachel smiled faintly. "She's lucky to have you looking out for her." "I'd say it's the other way around." His eyes twinkled, but the warmth was fleeting. Rachel recognized that look, the silent acknowledgement between people who knew, without needing to say it, what it meant to navigate the world with the quiet armor that came from years of being underestimated. Behind them, someone cleared their throat impatiently. Rachel gathered Jordan's backpack and stepped into the aisle. Linda's voice came over the speaker, thanking everyone for their cooperation. The sound of it scratched at Rachel's skin, but she kept her head high. Jordan's small hand slipped into hers as they walked forward. The moment they stepped into the terminal, Rachel felt the air shift. The sterile hum of the airport replaced the closeness of the cabin. But something else lingered, a weight Rachel couldn't quite shake. Jonathan, her brother, was waiting for them at the gate. His tall frame was easy to spot, even through the crowd of passengers. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his sharp eyes scanning the faces that passed by. Jordan's face lit up the moment he saw him. "Uncle John," Jordan called out, his legs moving faster than Rachel's grip could hold. Jonathan crouched, arms wide, scooping Jordan up with ease. "There's my guy," Jonathan grinned, spinning him once before settling him on his hip. Rachel approached slowly, her steps heavier than they had been that morning. Jonathan's gaze shifted to her, and in that brief exchange, Rachel saw the unspoken question in his eyes. "What happened?" he asked quietly, placing Jordan back on his feet. Rachel forced a smile for Jordan's sake. "Let's get our bags first." Jonathan said nothing, but the subtle clench of his jaw told her he wouldn't let it rest. In the quiet corner of the baggage claim, with Jordan kneeling on the floor playing with his toy dinosaur, Rachel recounted the events of the flight. Jonathan listened without interrupting. His arms were crossed, but his expression didn't shift until she mentioned Linda's sharp tone, the moment when Jordan's orange juice spilled and the entire cabin seemed to bear witness to their embarrassment. Rachel's voice lowered as she spoke. She didn't say anything outright, but she didn't have to. "You know how it is." Jonathan exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing. "She made you feel small," he said. Rachel nodded. Jonathan glanced at Jordan, who was now engrossed in lining up his dinosaurs along the edge of the bench. "He didn't notice much," Rachel said, almost defensively. "I handled it." Jonathan's gaze softened. "I know you did." Rachel looked down at her hands, the faint residue of orange juice still staining her fingertips. "But you shouldn't have had to." Jonathan didn't press the issue further until they were outside, the cold wind cutting through the late afternoon air. "You know, this isn't the first time I've heard a story like this," he said as they walked to the car. Rachel glanced at him. "I know. I could make some calls. File a formal complaint. They'll take it more seriously if it comes from me." Rachel stopped in her tracks, her grip tightening on Jordan's hand. "I don't want you to fight this battle for me," she said quietly. Jonathan's eyes met hers, steady but patient. "It's not just for you, Rachel." She looked away, unsure of how to respond. The truth was, she didn't want the attention, the exhausting conversations, the paperwork, the statements. But part of her also knew that silence was its own kind of surrender. Jonathan opened the car door for Jordan, buckling him into his seat. When he straightened up, he placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder. "Think about it," he said gently. "You've already done the hardest part. You held your head high when someone tried to take that from you." Rachel exhaled, leaning into the warmth of his hand. "I'll think about it," she said, though the weight of that decision pressed heavily on her chest. Jonathan smiled faintly. "That's all I ask." And as they drove away from the airport, Rachel watched the planes ascend into the sky, wondering how long it would take before the weight of the day lifted, before the distance between aisles and glances no longer felt like something she had to carry alone. The next morning, sunlight pooled through Rachel Carter's kitchen window, dappling the table where Jordan sat, carefully coloring between the lines of his dinosaur book. The simplicity of the moment should have felt grounding. It should have allowed Rachel to shake off the residue of the flight, the sharpness of Linda's tone, the hum of unspoken judgment that had followed her down the narrow aisle. But it hadn't. Rachel stood at the counter, stirring her coffee long after the sugar had dissolved. "Can I use green for his tail, Mama?" Jordan's voice cut through the quiet. Rachel smiled, leaning against the counter. "Green sounds perfect." He beamed at her answer, humming as he filled in the shape. Rachel let her gaze linger on him, his curls bouncing slightly each time he shifted in his chair. The soft scuff of his sneakers against the linoleum. She envied the ease with which children moved through the world, untouched by the subtleties adults carried like heavy stones. But that innocence had limits. Rachel remembered the way he'd looked up at her after spilling the juice. His eyes wide, searching for reassurance. Is she mad at us? He had known something was wrong, even if he couldn't yet name it. The thought made her stomach twist. The landline rang, pulling Rachel from her thoughts. She crossed the kitchen and lifted the receiver, tucking it between her ear and shoulder. "Morning." Jonathan's voice greeted her. "How's my nephew?" "He's good, coloring dinosaurs," Rachel replied, glancing at Jordan. "Glad to hear it." Jonathan's voice dipped slightly, shifting to something more serious. "You think about what we talked about?" Rachel sighed. She had expected this call. "I did," she said softly, tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I just don't know. Jonathan, what's the point? People like Linda don't change." Jonathan's silence stretched for a beat. "Maybe not, but companies do when their pockets are threatened." Rachel let out a quiet laugh. "You sound like Dad." Jonathan chuckled, though there was little humor in it. He wasn't wrong. Rachel's father had always believed that standing still in the face of disrespect wasn't an option. "You're teaching them how to treat you," he would say whenever Rachel hesitated to speak up. She glanced at Jordan again. The weight of that lesson felt heavier now. "I just want to keep my head down. Jonathan, I don't need the fight right now. But maybe someone else does." Jonathan replied gently. "You didn't ask to be in this situation, Rachel. But what happens if the next mother, someone without a voice, without a brother who's a lawyer, goes through the same thing? What if she thinks it's normal?" Rachel's grip on the phone tightened. Jonathan's words landed exactly where he intended them to. "Look," he continued, sensing her hesitation, "I'm not saying we drag this into the public eye. But at the very least, we file a complaint, quiet or loud. You decide the terms." Rachel closed her eyes briefly. The truth was, she hadn't stayed silent out of fear of confrontation. It was exhaustion, this weary understanding that, as a black woman, standing up for yourself often meant carrying the added burden of justifying why the offense mattered in the first place. You explain, you defend, and even then, you aren't always believed. But Jonathan was right. Silence was an inheritance Rachel wasn't willing to pass down to her son. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's file it. But I'm not making this into a crusade." "Fair enough," Jonathan replied, the faint note of relief evident in his voice. Rachel hung up the phone and watched Jordan for a long moment, wondering how much of this quiet battle he would one day come to understand. Later that evening, after Jordan had gone to bed, Rachel sat down at the kitchen table with a blank notepad and a pen. She began writing slowly, retracing the events of the flight, each moment when Linda's eyes lingered too long, each sharp word that had made Rachel feel small. But as the words filled the page, Rachel realized something. This wasn't just about Linda. It wasn't even about the juice. It was about the distance that lived between people, the space that had widened each time a fellow passenger looked away, unwilling to meet Rachel's gaze. It was the same distance that existed in offices, grocery stores, and schoolyards. The quiet reminder that even when no one was shouting, some lines were still drawn so clearly you could trip over them. Rachel set the pen down and exhaled, her shoulders relaxing for the first time all day. Jonathan was right. Maybe Linda wouldn't change, but Rachel wasn't doing this for her. She was doing it for the next woman who sat quietly in seat 14C, gripping her child's hand, and wondering if speaking up would be worth the cost. Rachel glanced down at her notes, feeling the flicker of something she hadn't expected, something that felt a little like hope. Rachel Carter had long understood that silence, when stretched thin enough, could cut sharper than words. It wasn't always the slurs or the raised voices that left scars, sometimes it was the absence of sound. The weight of indifference that lingered the longest. And yet, the night after she filed the complaint, the quiet in her home felt different. This silence wasn't avoidance or surrender. It felt like the steady breath before stepping forward. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, Jonathan's voice still clear in her ear from their earlier call. "It's filed. Now we wait." Rachel wasn't good at waiting. Across the room, the refrigerator hummed faintly, and the light above the stove cast long shadows across the floor. Jordan was asleep down the hall, his soft snores drifting through the thin walls. Rachel leaned back in her chair, letting her eyes close for a moment. But rest was fleeting, because even in the stillness, Rachel felt the familiar weight return, the creeping doubt that whispered, "Maybe nothing will come of this." She knew how these stories often ended. Even when you put everything in writing, even when the truth stared at them plainly from the page, the world had a way of reshaping the narrative until you barely recognized it. She could hear it already. Misunderstanding. Policy. Not personal. I'm sure she didn't mean anything by it. Rachel exhaled sharply, opening her eyes. But then she thought of Jordan. The way he had looked at her on the plane, searching for reassurance she hadn't been sure she could give. And that was enough. The following afternoon, Rachel stood outside Jordan's school, leaning against the fence as she waited for the final bell to ring. The sun hung low, casting long streaks of orange across the pavement. Other parents gathered in small clusters, chatting idly while their children tumbled across the playground. Rachel stayed apart, arms crossed loosely as she watched the door. But out of the corner of her eye, she noticed one of the mothers, Carol, from 3 blocks over, glancing in her direction. Rachel felt it immediately, that subtle, familiar hesitation. Carol approached carefully, her smile polite but thin. "Hey, Rachel." Rachel nodded in greeting. "Hey." Carol hesitated, shifting her purse to her other shoulder. I saw something online, about the airline thing." Rachel's body stiffened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Did you?" Carol's smile faltered just slightly. "Yeah, a couple of the moms were talking about it at the cafe this morning." Rachel didn't respond immediately. She knew what was coming. Carol pressed on. "I'm sure it was just one of those things. Right? People have bad days." Maybe she didn't realize how she came across. Rachel's eyes didn't leave the school door, but she felt her pulse quicken. "Maybe," Rachel replied coolly. But a bad day doesn't explain why she treated the folks in the front rows differently. Carol's smile froze, and for a brief moment, the air between them thickened with something unspoken. Rachel turned her gaze toward her, leveling her voice. "I've had bad days too, Carol. I've never used one to humiliate someone else." Carol shifted uncomfortably, her cheeks coloring slightly. "Of course, I didn't mean." But whatever excuse Carol had lined up was drowned out by the school bell. The doors burst open, and Jordan's voice cut through the tension. "Mama." Rachel smiled softly, crouching to catch him as he ran into her arms. Carol lingered a moment longer but said nothing else. She gave a faint nod before slipping back into the crowd of parents. Rachel brushed the hair from Jordan's forehead, pressing a kiss against his temple. "Can we get ice cream?" Jordan grinned, already tugging on her hand. Rachel laughed softly, the tension easing just slightly. "Yeah, baby, let's get ice cream." But later that night, after Jordan had been tucked into bed, Rachel found herself staring at her phone. The email from the airline sat unread in her inbox. She had been expecting it. Still, her hand hovered over the screen, reluctant to open it. Rachel exhaled slowly. Finally, she tapped the notification. Subject: response to formal complaint. The email was brief, wrapped in the language Rachel had grown accustomed to over the years. We take these matters seriously. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We apologize for any inconvenience you experienced. But one line stood out. A formal review of the employee's conduct is currently underway. We may reach out for further information. Rachel set the phone down carefully, her fingers brushing against the edge of the table. It wasn't much, but it was something. She leaned back, folding her arms across her chest. The distance between aisles, the space that had existed between her and Linda. Between Rachel and the silent passengers who had watched without speaking felt just a little narrower now. And that, Rachel thought, was enough for tonight. Rachel Carter had never trusted apologies that came dressed in the language of convenience. It wasn't that she didn't believe in the idea of forgiveness, she did. But in her experience, too many apologies were crafted not for the wounded, but for the comfort of those who offered them. They smoothed over cracks, not to mend, but to forget they had ever existed. And Rachel Carter had no interest in being forgotten. The email sat in her inbox like a stone she couldn't quite move. A formal review is underway. She had read those words 3 times now, each pass leaving her colder than the last. There was no acknowledgement of harm, no assurance that what she endured on that flight would not be repeated. Only procedural phrases carefully chosen to suggest action without the burden of accountability. Rachel pushed her chair back from the kitchen table, folding her arms as she stared at the screen. Jonathan's voice echoed in her head. It's a start, but Rachel wasn't so sure. The next afternoon, Rachel found herself in the grocery store, half listening to Jordan chatter beside her as he balanced a box of cereal under his arm like a trophy. She nodded absently, her mind still tangled in the threads of that email. Mama, can we get cookies too? Jordan tugged at her sleeve. Rachel glanced down, her hand moving to ruffle his curls. We'll see. But as they turned into the next aisle, Rachel's gaze caught on a familiar figure near the checkout counter. Linda. There she stood, in civilian clothes, sliding a carton of milk across the self-checkout scanner. Rachel's breath caught, and for a brief moment, she considered turning around, but Jordan's hand in hers steadied her. He hadn't noticed Linda. His attention was fixed on the candy display, his eyes wide with longing. Rachel's grip on the shopping cart tightened. Linda's eyes lifted, and their gazes met fleeting, but long enough for recognition to flicker between them. Rachel saw it then, the flash of discomfort that crossed Linda's face, as if she had hoped their paths would never intersect again. Rachel could have looked away. She didn't. Instead, she held Linda's gaze, letting the weight of it settle. She wanted Linda to feel what Rachel had carried during that flight, the quiet scrutiny. The knowledge that someone had seen her. Linda shifted, breaking the stare as she fumbled with her bag. Rachel said nothing. She didn't need to. Later that evening, after dinner, Rachel sat on the porch while Jordan played in the yard, his laughter filling the air as he chased after fireflies blinking against the dusky sky. Jonathan called, his voice warm but expectant. You get the email? He asked. I did, Rachel replied. Jonathan's silence stretched just long enough to confirm he knew how little comfort it offered. It's not enough, Rachel said finally, her voice steady but low. They want this to disappear. A review. Some vague policy adjustments, they think that's the end of it. Jonathan exhaled through the receiver. So, what do you want to do? Rachel watched Jordan sprint barefoot across the grass, his arms outstretched like wings. I want to make sure she remembers. Rachel said softly. I want to know that the next time she stands in front of someone like me, she thinks twice. Jonathan's voice was calm, but Rachel could hear the undercurrent of pride. She will, he said, and if she doesn't, we'll make sure someone else does. Rachel smiled faintly, letting the weight of the day slowly unravel. She didn't need Linda's apology. She needed her to remember. And that, Rachel thought, was something far more lasting. Rachel Carter knew that real change rarely arrived in grand, sweeping gestures. It came quietly, like rain soaking into the cracks of parched earth one drop at a time. And yet, she also knew this. There were moments that refused to stay small. She was beginning to understand that the flight, the orange juice, the clipped words of a woman in a pressed uniform, was not simply an isolated experience. It was a thread in a much larger tapestry woven tight by years of silent looks and heavier doors. Rachel stood in her living room, gazing out the window as the afternoon sun stretched long across the sidewalk. Jordan sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully arranging his dinosaurs in a half-circle. Stegosaurus goes here, he whispered, nudging the green figure into place. Rachel smiled faintly. The simplicity of his world felt like something she needed to protect. Her phone vibrated on the table. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Rachel hesitated, but answered. Ms. Carter? A woman's voice. Polite but professional. This is Anna Pierce from the airline's corporate office. I wanted to follow up on the complaint you filed last week. Rachel straightened, the weight of the call settling on her shoulders. Yes, Rachel replied, her voice calm. I remember. There was a pause. The faint rustle of papers on the other end. First, I'd like to thank you for your patience, Anna said, her words rehearsed. We take these matters very seriously. After reviewing your case and conducting internal interviews, we've decided to implement additional training for our staff to address. Rachel closed her eyes briefly, letting the familiar cadence wash over her. She knew the rhythm well. These apologies were carefully engineered to disarm without offering much in return. Ms. Pierce, Rachel interrupted softly, but firmly, I appreciate the effort, but I didn't file that complaint for training modules and pamphlets. I filed it because I wanted someone to understand what happened on that plane wasn't policy. It was personal. Anna hesitated, clearly unused to being interrupted. Rachel leaned against the window, her gaze distant but steady. I need to know, Rachel continued, her voice sharpening, that the next time Linda or anyone else looks at someone like me, they won't feel entitled to handle us differently. I need to know there's more than just policy standing between us. Another pause, longer this time. I understand, Anna said at last, her voice quieter, and I want to acknowledge that Linda Harrington is no longer with the company. This was not the first incident involving passenger relations, but yours was the one that moved the needle. Rachel felt the weight shift slightly in her chest. Not victory, not relief, but something in between. Anna's voice softened, as if she, too, understood the difference. I can't undo what happened, she said, but I hope this is a step toward ensuring it doesn't happen again. Rachel let the words settle, allowing herself a small breath. Thank you, Rachel said. I hope it is too. When the call ended, Rachel placed the phone down gently, her fingers lingering over the screen. Across the room, Jordan glanced up. Mama? He asked, tilting his head. You okay? Rachel smiled, walking over to sit beside him. She pulled him into her lap, his head resting against her shoulder. I'm okay, baby, she whispered, smoothing his curls. Jordan held up one of his dinosaurs. This one's the strongest, he said proudly, showing her a Tyrannosaurus. Rachel chuckled softly, pressing a kiss to his temple. I think you're right, she replied, but even as she sat there, wrapped in the warmth of her son's small arms, Rachel knew that strength wasn't always about being the loudest or the biggest. Sometimes strength was simply refusing to let the small moments stay small. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rachel Carter felt the quiet power of knowing that for once someone else would remember too.